He has resurrected the morning line at themorningline.substack.com. Paul Daugherty. Doc, how are you on this Friday? There you go. You got the lid to show off and everything.
Shameless plug.
TML.
Yeah, shameless.
There's
plug.
nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. We are all about shameless plugs. If we can make a buck or two from it. I loved your, as you so masterfully do regularly, of taking a headline from one thing and then weaving it into the narrative of a separate topic. And that was, you don't live in Cleveland. That was your column the other day, of course, resurrecting the famous words of Sam Weish right there on the field, grabbed the PA microphone at Riverfront Stadium and reminded everybody to behave. You don't live in Cleveland, you live in Cincinnati. But then you spun that into, as far as baseball goes, you probably did wish you lived in Cleveland to follow a team like the Guardians. Because it really is amazing to me what that franchise continues to do every single year. And, Doc, you tell me if you agree with me or not. In a day and age where people say managers don't make a difference, I think Terry Francona has made a difference.
I do, too. I think the notion that they win and lose games with strategies and lineups and that kind of thing, overblown. Even more so now with all the numbers that are in the game now. I think what managers and any coaches, for that matter, do best is set tones. Keep guys happy, keep guys excited, keep guys wanting to come to the ballpark every day. I mean, across 6 months and 162 games, that is a grind. You know, Scott Rowland used to call it the big 162, and he would wonder why teams that actually won divisions didn't get more credit than teams that than won it all. And it was a fair point because it takes a lot out of you day after day to play the game. And the manager who's able to set the tone and get the most from his players effort-wise just about every day is to me, more important than the guy who knows every stat ever created. And I think Terry Francona is that way. He's old school. He understands the game. He had those guys playing relaxed and confident down the stretch. And he did it with a very young team, youngest team in baseball. Guys that may or may not be really sure of themselves. I thought he did a fabulous job with a team that on paper should be just kind of okay, but should be even better next year and the year after that and the year after that because of the job their front office has done.
Okay, well, with that in mind, and I think it's safe to say, even though Cleveland, as you mentioned, is the youngest team in baseball, and they were quite shrewd as they traded away some of the biggest names there are in the sport, including Francisco Lindor, among others, and they got a lot in return for those trades. You pointed out their middle infield is made up of guys they made in that trade with the New York Mets. But with that in mind, so we all agree, Cleveland is a more talented team than the Cincinnati Reds. What kind of tone is David Bell setting for the Reds, do you think?
Well, it's going to sound like a cop-out, and that's probably because it is. I don't know. I kind of look at him the way I used to look at Bengals coaches. You know, I mean, there was one guy who was obviously out of his element, and that was Dave Shula. But was Bruce Coslett? I don't know. I mean, he went on to coach the Jets. Was Dick LeBeau? Probably not. He was a Hall of Fame assistant. So I don't know. I think if you give David Bell a decent roster, it would have been really interesting. You give David Bell Francona's roster from this year and see if he gets them into the playoffs. Then we can start judging David Bell. I think that they had a competitive team last year and they fell short. And they fell short in a way that would lead you to have doubts about the manager, frankly, because they lost big at the end of the year. This year, I don't know. They didn't have the players. And the players that they did have, they traded away. And the guys that they didn't trade away got hurt. So to judge David on this year is kind of silly. I think if you look at his whole body of work, sure, you have doubts because he hasn't won anything yet. And there have been cases when he had the players possibly to go further than he has. But I don't know. It's a kind of a chicken and egg thing, Thom.
Okay.
It's always hard for me to look at a manager and say he's good or he's not. I think there's so much more involved in just the lineups he runs out there or the in-game decisions he makes.
Okay, let's shift gears to football. We were just walking through the schedule, and everybody will make reference to the schedule for the Bengals over their final 7 games of the year, but rarely do you start really looking at it game by game. We've talked about, is a game a must-win game at times for the Bengals in the early part of this season. Look, when you're 2-3, in my opinion, you tell me if you agree or not. Every game starts becoming a must-win game, especially when you look at that back half of the schedule, because we just walked through the 7 games they're playing to end the season. And, the one you look at and say, okay, I probably feel pretty good about is going to New England. And I don't know how good you feel about going to New England. So, based on their history, if nothing else, I know Tom Brady's not there, but Doc, these next 5, 6, 7 weeks, Zach Taylor's got to have this team ready to play, man. They can't be stubbing their toe over this next 5, 6 game stretch. It just can't happen.
Well, I think they needed to bank the wins early. I had them. When you do, you go through the schedule and it comes out and you think, no, they're going to win this game, and you analyze it and try to figure it out. I had them at 4-1 at this point. So you're not talking to an expert on the Bengals. I was more optimistic or naive than smart. That said, yeah. Although I don't think this division is good enough that anybody is going to run away with it, and they still have 12 games to go. Some of those wins you kind of counted on. I thought they would beat Pittsburgh. I didn't think they'd go to Dallas and win, but I did think that they would go to Baltimore and win. So yeah, you're right. They need to win now, and they need to bank some wins. So at the end of the year, when everybody's around, 6-6 or 7-5 or whatever it's going to be going into the home stretch, they're right there at 6-6 or 7-5.
When you talk about some of the injuries, and we're talking specifically about a couple of guys that could have a huge impact of being there, or it looks more and more like not being there. The one that worries me is the left tackle. Jonah Williams has not played particularly well this season, but he's a starting left tackle. Isaiah Prince is a guy who got a chance to play. He had his ups and downs, but he's a backup for a reason. Do you think that is a more important position for the Bengals this Sunday than having T. Higgins back or not?
Yeah, probably. You see, I think that Williams has played okay. I think his statistics, he grades out okay. I may be wrong about that because I don't live and die with numbers, but he's been a little bit better than adequate. And given the fact that whole line has been a little bit less than adequate, I think he's been one of the bright spots there. That said, you don't want to go into a road game in New Orleans, even though their defense isn't that great, without your starting left tackle. You hope again that they scheme around that they can get away with that for a week with the plays they call. Now, if they're without Higgins and Jonah Williams, yeah, I mean, obviously they showed last week what effect not having Higgins had, and it wasn't a very good one. I'm still waiting for them to remember that Tyler Boyd actually plays for them. Pretty good slot receiver. They've decided to put Chase in there on occasion. They haven't gotten the ball to Boyd very much. I think maybe this week they ought to rediscover Tyler Boyd. And maybe he can put a placard around his neck. Hi, I'm Tyler Boyd. Throw me the ball.
I'm 1,000% with you there. I just think Boyd's a hell of a player and has been for a long, long time. He plays with a lot of fire and a lot of passion, and I think that's something that's very important to the success of any team, especially a guy that's been around as long as he has been around. You know, the thing that just continues to dumbfound me, Doc, is, you know, and look, I'm like you in a lot of ways. When I used to, you know, broadcast NFL games every week, and from time to time, I'd have a partner that would start slipping into some of this football jargon, this, you know, A gap and, you know, the blah, 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 and all this sort of thing. And I think a lot of fans might think they know about it. But I think for a lot of them as well, they're like me, their eyes start folding up in the back of their head, and they're just like, this is nonsense. But this Tampa 2 defense thing, right, has been around forever. Tony Dungy and Monty Kiffin and these guys are the ones that I guess made it most famous. Maybe it was around by somebody before that. I don't know. But Tampa certainly made it most famous. That's why it's called Tampa 2. And the Bengals' inability to make some kind of an adjustment, because the one team that decided we're not going to play Tampa 2 against them was the New York Jets, because Robert Saleh's style of defense is not a Tampa 2 scheme. And the Bengals had decent success against the Jets. But if you're a team, why would you play anything else against the Bengals until they prove that they can beat it?
Well, I wouldn't. It's been around at least since Jeff Blake. I remember when Jeff Blake burst onto the scene and throwing bombs to Darnay Scott and Carl Pickens, and suddenly everybody figured that out, and they went to cover 2, Tampa 2, whatever you want to call it, took the deep ball away, and suddenly Jeff Blake was no longer Jeff Blake. So it's been a while. Well, I'll say what everybody else has said about it, Tom. You got to run. You got to be able to run the ball to loosen that up. If they can't run the ball, there's no need for them to get off that cover 2. So Tampa 2, whatever. That they go hand in glove. Mixon showed signs last week. Yep. That maybe he's going to break out of this, and if they give him holes, which they did for the most part last week, let's hope he takes advantage of it, and that could loosen the whole thing up. But you're right, they've got a problem, especially if Higgins is still hurt.
What are you writing about today? Did you have a morning line come out today?
Yeah, well, I haven't finished it yet. I'll have it done probably half an hour after we're done talking here. Fridays, I like to lighten up, so I've got 2 people that I rely on and have for a long time. One guy tells us what to drink on the weekend, and the woman tells us where to go and drink.
Right.
Yeah, things to do around town. Plus, I not going to New Orleans, missing a great road trip. I kind of reflect on what is the best thing to do in every city, according to me, in the NFL, because the trips were always the best part. You know, the games were the penance I had to do to get to go on the trip. So I list every city with a great spot. And I reflect a little bit on Andy Dalton. And Andy Dalton was an interesting guy in this town. And when people ask me over the years, what do I think of Andy Dalton? I basically tell them, when I think of Andy Dalton, I think of all the things he didn't do, not the things that he did. And that's not fair, but it's accurate. Andy Dalton didn't win a playoff game. Andy Dalton missed a wide open A.J. Green in the end zone in Houston one year in the playoffs, late in the game. Andy Dalton was not an elevator man. That's what I used to say. Never elevated the team. He could keep the team in games. He was a caretaker kind of guy. Very rarely did he make the Bengals better. That said, he won 70 games here, 70 and 61, I think. Made 3 Pro Bowls, and with Marvin Lewis got this franchise back to a level that made last year's season possible. So a little bit about Andy Dalton.
That's good, and that is spot on in Andy Dalton. I always tell the story all the time, Doc, when I was living in Chicago and doing the Cubs games, and I remember in the middle of the summer, I think it was, or maybe it was at the beginning of summer, when very successful, very popular head basketball coach of the Chicago Bulls was Doug Collins. Great player. You remember Doug Collins as a player, fantastic player, and a really good coach. And they had Michael Jordan come in, and they got to the playoffs a couple of times, but they would get beat by either the Pistons or the Celtics or somebody like that, and they just couldn't advance on. And then shockingly, Jerry Reinsdorf, the owner, Jerry Krause, the general manager, fire Doug Collins. And I'll never forget just watching that press conference on television in my apartment where the line was by Jerry Krause. He said, Doug Collins got us from point A to point B in building up these franchises. They're introducing some guy that you'd have to be a New York Knicks fan to ever even know who he was in Phil Jackson. He said, Phil Jackson is going to take us from point B to point C, and C stands for championships. And we know, they almost won enough rings over the next decade to fill both hands. That, to me, was Marvin Lewis and Andy Dalton. They were A to B to really do a nice job for this franchise. Is that a fair point?
I think it's completely fair. And if you look at Andy's career since he left here, he's been a backup primarily. He's got an 8-9 record. And that's Andy Dalton, great guy. Everybody in the locker room loved him. Not a bad word would ever be said about Andy Dalton, who's a good person as well, but did not possess that, whatever you want to call it. People call it the it factor. That's necessary for really good quarterbacks to have. Andy never, bless him, he never had that. And Sunday he'll probably go, 17 for 25 for 202 yards, a touchdown, and an interception, and the Saints will lose by a field goal.
Yep. I think you're right. Doc, thanks for the time. Looking forward to checking out. It's themorningline.substack.com. Enjoy your weekend, my friend.
Thanks, Thom.
All right, Paul Daugherty, kind enough to join us a couple times a week. We love having him.